Hello, everyone out there, and welcome to
Tracing Text
with Anton,
and Sylvia.
coming to you live from deep in the heart of the state of Tennessee. And today we're going to be talking about an author that not a lot of people really know about. It's an author that I have been reading about in the last couple of years or so, but particularly in the last few months. And it's an author that I hope will be of interest to everybody out there.
So we're on episode 13, and this author is Alejandro Sawa, you say? And you're going to be focusing on a specific novel of his, correct?
That's right. The novel is called in Spanish La Cima de Igúzquiza, and in English it could be translated as something like the Cave of Igúzquiza or the Chasm of Igúzquiza. And it's a novel that's not very well known. In fact, Sawa himself, when he wrote some autobiographical book that was published after he passed away, called Iluminaciones en la Sombra, Illuminations in Shadow, he actually did not mention this novel. He mentioned the others he wrote, but not this one. So it's definitely not one of the best-known novels that he wrote. He didn't write a lot of novels either, but this one is definitely one of his lesser-known, and it's one that I find fascinating for many reasons. And we're going to be talking about it a little bit on this 13th episode of Tracing Text today.
Excellent. Well, why don't you start with a little bit of the biographical background of the author?
It's quite interesting. He led a very interesting, though rather short life, kind of intense but short. He was born in Malaga, in the south of Spain, in March of 1862, and he became one of the most important, one of the most popular Bohemian writers in Spain, what is known as La Bohemia Española. La Bohemia really refers to a group of writers and artists that gathered in Madrid in the late 19th century, also in the early 20th century, mirroring in several ways the ideals of the French Bohemian writers, people like Baudelaire, Verlaine, Rimbaud, and several others. These writers, just like the French counterparts, were fairly poor. They didn't earn enough money to make ends meet. Some of them lived in squalor. And I shouldn't be laughing about that, really, but they try to publish their poems, their articles, wherever and whenever they got a chance to, and they even resorted to swindling, to asking for money of friends and people that they were sort of like acquaintances, just to get by, just to survive.
Right, so they were quite marginalized in terms of a society, especially when we consider them to be writers or producing intellectual sort of texts.
And in some cases, it was a self-imposed
marginalization.
They liked to meet at cafes. They would converse about art, about politics, about many other things. Some of them even wrote some of their works at those cafes. It's not like they had an office that they went to.
So this is their space, their creative space, in fact.
Yes, they basically merged life and literature, art and life in a very interesting way.
And perhaps this may have affected their art because we know that it's far from prosaic. In fact, the symbolists are known for being really hostile to plain meaning. And so maybe their being at a cafe, drinking something, could have affected
Oh yes, in the case of Sawa, definitely that way of life would take its toll, as we will see later on. Sawa was one of the most highly regarded among these Bohemios Españoles, simply because he spent some time in Paris, and also because he had a certain kind of magnetic personality that attracted a lot of people. And that is a constant throughout his really interesting life. He grew up in Seville in the south of Spain, but then in 1881 he moved to Madrid, the capital of Spain, for the very first time, and he wanted to follow a literary career. He wanted to start a career, and so he started to participate in all these gatherings we're talking about in Madrid cafes with all the different Bohemian writers and artists, and that's basically part of what he did for most of his life, and particularly in the 1880s, he did a lot of that while in Madrid. But he also published in the 1880s 6 novels in 3 years.
Oh, wow, that's super prolific.
At least at that point in his
Right,
life,
in
he
his
was.
life, he's very productive.
So
yes.
between 1885 and 1888, he published 6 novels in 3 years, and one of them is La Cima de Igúzquiza, or the Cave of Igúzquiza, the one we're talking about today. And all of these novels, at this point, I'll tell you a couple of their titles. La Mujer de Todo el Mundo, the woman that belongs to everyone. Legal Crime, Crimen Legal. La Declaración de un Vencido, the Declaration of a Defeated. And, of course, this one that we're talking about, La Cima de Igúzquiza.
Right.
They all belong to this naturalistic period in his literary career. And, of course, a lot of these writers were very adept at describing the kind of life that they led and the kind of characters they met. And, you know, there's a lot of real-life descriptions of prostitutes and of the cafes and of the different character types that they actually met in their real day-to-day life.
So it's more than realism. It definitely goes beyond that. Do you think it has somewhat to do with the changes that are occurring in terms of, you know, the social sciences are developing, biology is also gaining ground, and so the idea that, you know, certain negative traits are inherent in certain people?
Most definitely, it has a lot to do with that. And also, you know, in the 19th century is basically the century of the press. And so they had lots of different chances to publish articles in the newspapers and literary magazines and that sort of thing. And that way they could make a little money. Some of them more than others, of course. But that definitely was an outlet for their art and for their texts. And so a lot of them lived this life. A lot of them came from more rural parts of Spain into Madrid or into Barcelona sometimes. In search of a literary career. And of course, a little bit like, you know, country singers go to Nashville to start a career in music, or, you know, singers go to New York, or actors go to LA. A little bit like that. Was what was going on here. And so a lot of these writers actually wrote about the sense of defeat sometimes of not being able to succeed.
Right, so there's a sense of despair in their writing.
A sense of disappointment in some cases as well, when they see that their dream does not really conform to their reality once they get to Madrid. Now, in the case of Sawa, you know, it's a little bit different, particularly because sometime in late 1889 or in early 1890, it's not clear when this happened, he moved to Paris, to France, and there he lived until 1896. So it's about 5-6 years in Paris. And he talks in that work I talked about before, Illuminations in Shadow, Iluminaciones en la Sombra. He talks, or he writes very fondly about these years in Paris. It's almost like a golden age of his life. The best years of his life, in his opinion, were the ones that he spent in Paris, because he basically leads a similar kind of life as the one he led previously in Madrid. But he becomes very friendly with Paul Verlaine,
which is a very famous poet.
With the great French poet. And I think Verlaine even wrote a sonnet or a poem for Sawa, or dedicated to Sawa, which he kept until the end of his life. And Verlaine himself would actually die during Sawa's stay in Paris. Besides this bohemian sort of life, he found work as a translator. He worked for a couple of publishing houses translating works, for example, works by the Goncourt. You know, he translated some of that. And he also married a French woman by the name of Jeanne or Juana Poirier, and she would be his wife for the rest of his life. They were married until his death in 1909. It's a really untimely death.
He dies very young, indeed.
So these years in Paris are really important for him.
Right.
Very important as in his, I guess, in his development as a writer.
Right.
But in January of 1896, he returns to Madrid. Not clear really why he did that. But as he gets to Madrid, he becomes this almost revered figure because he has been in Paris. He has met Paul Verlaine. He has been friends with him.
Right.
You know, he spoke French.
Right.
That's
so it gives him a higher status upon his return. Then.
So he and his wife Juana and their little daughter Elena returned to Madrid. In the case of Elena, it's not really a return because she had never been in Madrid, I don't think. And he becomes a journalist at this point. This is what we were talking about, the age of the press, lots of different newspapers, and he starts writing columns and articles in the newspapers, and he devotes most of the rest of his life to that. He didn't really write
any more fiction?
Any more, well, he's written some. He wrote some fiction, but not really any full-length novel as far as I know. He did begin writing this autobiographical diary-like work, Iluminaciones en la Sombra, which would not be published in his lifetime. It would be published after his death. In I think, well, he died in 1909, and this work was published in 1910, so about a year after he died.
Right. So what happens then while he's in Madrid and he's, working for newspapers and, staying kind of busy? Does he just focus on work?
He focuses on work, but he's still the bohemian, you know, and so he's still out all night at the cafes and meets friends there to chat about things, different kinds of things to drink, you know. And it's like Willie Nelson says, nightlife ain't no good life, but it's my life, and that he basically lived by that motto, which he didn't know about, of course, and that actually took its toll after a while, and his health starts declining fairly rapidly with the beginning of the 20th century, to such an extent that by the time he dies in 1909, he has gone blind.
Oh, wow.
And he's had to dictate his texts. He also had lots of financial problems. He had to resort to writing articles that other people would sign.
Oh, wow.
So he became sort of like a ghostwriter.
Oh,
exactly.
My goodness, yes.
And in fact, he wrote several that Rubén Darío, the great modernist poet, took credit for.
Wow.
Apparently there was a feud between the two of them because at the end of his life, Alejandro Sawa wanted money. He needed money, and Darío wasn't helping him out, and so he reminded him, hey, I wrote those articles for you, and you never paid me enough, that sort of thing.
Right.
But in any case, he had lots of problems, both financially and as far as health is concerned. And in March of 1909, he dies in Madrid, a few days shy of his 47th birthday.
Very young.
He was 46, almost 47 when he died.
Makes me think like he was probably drinking a lot of absinthe. That was the period where that was very popular.
Possibly, yes. Yeah. A kind of liquor that in Spanish is known as ajenjo. Also, he also drank quite a bit of that.
Yes.
He lived on that part of the time. So obviously, you can't live long like that.
No, definitely not. So, what happens after you say that he influences many writers.
Yes,
as a
definitely.
result. Even though he had a very short life, he does have a great impact.
A lot of people were drawn to his personality. He had quite a magnetic personality, like I said before. He was also a fairly handsome man, and a lot of people were drawn to him, the way he talked, the things he did. He was quite eccentric sometimes. And he definitely influenced a respectable number of writers, especially many from the generation of 1898.
Right.
And they often alluded to him in his works. Pío Baroja, for example, talks about him in El Árbol de la Ciencia. They very often fictionalized his life, so a lot of the information we get about him from these writers is not always something that we can trust necessarily, because fiction comes into play there.
Right.
And more importantly, Ramón María del Valle Inclán,
Right.
one of the most important writers at
Of
that
course.
time in Spain, one of the classics, used Alejandro Sawa as the inspiration for Max Estrella, the main character in the very famous play that Valle Inclán wrote,
Right.
by the title of Luces de Bohemia.
Right.
Basically, Luces de Bohemia is a grotesque dramatization of the life, the way of life of these Bohemian writers, and as I guess as a representative of these writers,
Right.
he chooses Sawa. And that gives you an
He
idea of how
embodies.
he embodies the whole thing. It's incredible how popular he was
Right.
with this group of writers, at such an extent that he becomes Max Estrella in the fictional world of Luces de Bohemia.
The biggest star, right
Exactly.
there. Literally.
The maximum star.
The maximum.
But he's presented, of course, through the lens of, through a grotesque lens
Right.
of esperpento, which is
Right.
the kind of theatrical mode or that Valle Inclán was known
Right.
for. You're listening to a new episode of
Tracing Text.
With Anton
And Sylvia.
and we're talking today about the great Alejandro Sawa, not a very well-known writer, but
Here we are, and
Here we are
learning
talking about
about him, right? So now that we've talked about his background, his life, tell us about, you wanted to focus specifically on his novel.
yes, this
So-
was a very prolific chunk of his life, 3 years during which he wrote 6 novels.
Right.
Now, not all the novels were very long. Actually, most of them were fairly short. They could be classified more like novellas or short novels,
Right.
because they were not very long. And one of these 6 novels that he published between 1885 and 1888 is La Cima de Igúzquiza, or the Cave or the Chasm of Igúzquiza. Igúzquiza is hard to pronounce.
I know, I'm like, I don't want to say the Igúzquiza.
Because it's located in the northeast of Spain, close to the Basque Country, I think in the region
Okay.
of Navarra.
Okay.
And so it's a sort of Basque-like
word.
Place name.
Place name, so it's not Spanish or it doesn't have Latin origins.
As far as I know, it doesn't really sound like it. And it's a real place where there was, and I'm not sure if there still is, this cave that's very deep. Not very wide, but very deep. And so certain horrific things happen there.
Okay.
Executions and that sort of stuff in that cave or around that cave. Especially during the Third Carlist War.
Okay.
Now, the Carlist Wars took place throughout the 19th century in Spain, and they faced the liberals with the Carlists,
Right.
who were more proponents of absolute or absolutist monarchy.
Right.
So, a lot more conservative, the Carlists, than the liberals, of course.
Were the liberals more for a democratic sort of government, or were they still monarchists?
I would say they were more for a democratic sort of monarchy, a constitution, and that sort of thing.
Right.
Of course, in Spain, the republic was never a very popular idea.
Right.
It didn't last for too long in the 19th century. It only lasted for a few years in the 20th century, and right now, Spain is a monarchy still.
Right.
So there were definitely, the liberals were more progressive. The Carlists were quite conservative in that way. And there were 3 of these wars, and the action of the Cave of Igúzquiza is set in 1871, so just a year before the beginning of the Third Carlist War.
Excellent. So now, you said it's a very, we talked a little bit right before our podcast. You have here a note to the reader, so.
That's right. This is a novel that was written before he left for Paris. It was published before he left for Paris. And if the plot actually is set in 1871, it was only about 16 years before,
Right.
or 17 years before he wrote it, or it was
Right.
published. So it's quite a contemporary
Setting.
setting. That's for sure. So it's based on a real historical episode, and because it's based on a real historical episode, he has at the very beginning a note to the reader that prefaces the novel and informs the reader that the text will focus on the figure of the bloody bandit by the name of Felix Domingo Rosa de Samaniego. He usually talks about him or refers to him as Felix
Okay.
in the text. He wreaked havoc with his band of thieves and assassins right before the Third Carlist War. He was in support of the Carlists. And Sawa goes as far as to include excerpts from the trial, the real trial against Felix Samaniego, in order to show that this really is an accurate historical account.
Right.
Now the problem is, this is a naturalistic novel. It belongs to naturalism, so there's going to be a very clear exaggeration of certain aspects, fictionalization of certain aspects of the character of Felix, and an invention of several things that actually did not happen, but that actually work for the kind of story that he's telling. Now, this is the problem, Sylvia, that we always have with historical novels. Is a historical novel history, or is it fiction?
Right.
My take on this would be that any time history enters literature, it gives up its historical character. It gives up, it stops being history, and it becomes fiction.
Right.
It could be based on historical facts, but we cannot take literature as history, because history has its basis on facts of reality that could be verified.
Right.
But literature doesn't.
Right, but I think it's an interesting point that you make, because I don't disagree with you on that part. But history itself, although history as we understand it is composed of facts, it's always woven through a narrative. And that narrative itself is a fiction.
It could be a fiction, yes.
Because, if you think about it, perspective, who's telling, the account, whatever that is. So I think that it's an interesting idea. Of course, this is a novel, so it's definitely in the realm of fiction. But even history itself, if we think of like Hayden White, his questioning of history itself.
Well, it is a narrative.
It's a narrative, ultimately.
History is told in the form of a narrative, but
which is not necessarily like the way it happened exactly.
Exactly.
So then, therefore, it's a
now,
fiction.
if you think of the work of a historian, in theory, it should be the kind of work that could be verified factually.
Right.
Which, that is a principle that may or may not hold, depending on who we're talking about. And of course, there's going to be a certain amount of perspective and even fiction when one tells, when one writes history, right? But at the same time, if we compare history with literature, in the case of literature, there's never any intention or any necessity of verifying absolutely anything, because Don Quixote did not exist.
Right.
It did not exist outside of the book, is what I'm saying. In the case of Felix Samaniego, he actually existed outside of the book, but the way in which Alejandro writes about him is a literary way, even though he claims it's not. He says this is factual and it's not fiction. These are the facts about his life, but he is seeing his life and these facts through the lens of naturalism.
Right.
And what is naturalism? Well, it's a subtype of realism. Inspired by the novels of writers such as Émile Zola in France, for example. It was very popular in Spain in the late 19th century. Think of Pardo Bazán, for example, and Los Pasos de Ulloa, and many other novels that she wrote, La Madre Naturaleza, por ejemplo. It focuses, though, and this is the important thing, on the ugliest
aspects.
the most terrible aspects and sides of reality. So base human emotions, violence, poverty, filth,
Right.
etc. Right. So we will see in just a second that this novel is particularly violent. Violent in many ways, but violent towards women and female characters in particular. And besides that, it's a novel that shows one of the most important features of Sawa's novels is their anti-clericalism. He was very much against the way in which the Catholic Church ran religion,
Okay.
the way it organized religion. And so in his novels,
There's much criticism of that.
a lot of it.
A lot of it.
All the time. It's very difficult to find a priest in a Sawa novel that is
That's in a positive light.
In a positive way. No way. You will not find that. Look elsewhere because you're not going to find it there.
I see that there's a trend, though, in literature written in Spanish of anti-clericalism.
Yes, I guess, a lot of these writers perceived the way the Catholic Church was so, in many ways still is, so close to political power,
Right.
as stifling.
Right.
One of the novels by Sawa that I have not mentioned is called Criadero de Curas, and it talks about a seminary in a very negative.
Sounds negative.
From a very negative perspective. Right? Let's put it that way. I haven't read that one yet, but
Maybe
but
we
I'm
can
looking
present
forward
on
to
that one
maybe
one of
someday.
these days.
Maybe someday. We'll see what our audience thinks about the one we're going to talk about. We're talking about today, La Cima de Igúzquiza, or the Cave of Igúzquiza by Alejandro Sawa. This is a new episode, number 13 already, of
Tracing Text.
with Anton
and Sylvia.
Alejandro Sawa is the writer that we have today, that we're talking about today. We don't have him here, of course,
No.
because, like
He
I said,
passed away a
he passed
long
away
time ago.
over 100 years ago.
Wow.
But this novel, incidentally, has not been translated into English. It is available in an edition by the Spanish publisher Valdemar. And the edition is from, I believe, I have it right here, it's from 2011. So it's still possible to find if you read Spanish and are interested in this novel. And it's an edition by Amelina Correa Ramon. She does a good job of introducing this text. Yes, and there's also another novel called Historia de una Reina. That's more of a modernist novel, because Sawa has two different periods in his career.
Yeah.
First, the naturalist. Second, after he comes back to Madrid from Paris, the modernist.
Okay.
And the other, I wouldn't say novel, it's like a long tale.
Right.
Historia de una Reina, the story of a queen.
So this novel is divided into 4 chapters.
Yes, it's not very long, so it's divided into 4 chapters, and I would like to go very quickly, chapter by chapter, making a few comments about some of the content of these chapters. So the first chapter presents the main characters, and who are they? It's a rainy night at an inn, and the characters that appear there are Felix.
Of course, that bloody bandit.
The bloody bandit, very much so. Gergon, who is is going to become one of his minions, one of the members of this band of thieves and assassins that he's putting together. And very importantly, Father Contento, El Padre Contento. Look at that last name.
Yeah, exactly.
Contento, happy or content. But he's really manipulative. He is a very fanatic priest.
Okay.
So here we go. The anti-clericalism is right there from the very beginning.
With the name is supposed to be ironic.
It is very ironic, very much so, because we will see that his behavior is absolutely reprehensible, and it doesn't make the reader happy or content to read about him. Felix has spent 4 years and 4 months in jail for theft. And his former girlfriend, and this is very important, Francisca, has married someone else, Sebastian, who never appears in the novel, while Felix has been in jail. And this makes Felix really unhappy and upset. Felix is described as a brute, as a very violent man who threatens to kill everyone. At some point he says, voy a matar a todos. I'm going to kill everybody. And the priest, El Padre Contento, tries to and succeeds in convincing Felix of the need to put together this band of thieves to wreak havoc on the liberal population. So it's not really an idea of Felix originally, but he is manipulated by the priest into becoming the leader of this gang of thieves. And that's basically the idea in chapter 1. It kind of introduces the situation.
All of the characters.
But chapter 2 takes us back to the past of the main character.
I think Felix. A lot the naturalist novels always delve into the past because, like I said, the idea of what brought about their particular characteristics and why they're flawed. Is it something that's hereditary, or is it the social aspects that make them such terrible human beings?
That's right. If you look at Los Pasos de Ulloa, for example, there's a certain kind of determinism there.
Right.
Same thing here with Sawa, but not exactly the same way. And we will see why. We learn at the very beginning of chapter 2 some more information about the past of Felix. He was born poor, he doesn't have a father, his mother appears to be the opposite of Felix, very typical also in these naturalist novels. She's hardworking, she loves him unconditionally, really. But he is cold, he decides not to work.
He's lazy.
He's really lazy, much preferring to become a thug that everybody fears. So the determinism here is not so clear, because even though he's born poor, Felix is the one who decides himself, no, I don't want to work.
But we don't know much about the father, though.
We don't know anything about the father.
Right. I'm not trying to question, I'm just saying that leaves that possibility.
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
However, you have to think that at some point, when you think of determinism, you have this idea that something is already written for this character, and the character doesn't have a chance to really make any decision.
But here
whereas in this book, very clearly,
the
narrator makes it clear that he decides that work is not for him. And, this is going to become important because he all of a sudden, he's this brute, this animal, this monster. He's described as a monster sometimes.
And again, his name is, Contento is happy, but Felix also, although this is coincidence because this is based on a true historical...
Yes. But you could read it that way. It's kind of ironic in a way that, his name is Felix, meaning happy.
Right.
When he's not a happy character.
Nor does he make anybody else happy.
No, he doesn't even try to make anybody else happy. For example, he is incredibly abusive to his girlfriend, Francisca. That's when we learn of Francisca and their story together for a while. And he even tries to rape her at some point, though he does not succeed because she starts yelling, and she's actually a little bit stronger than one might think. And so some police officers hear about it and appear on the scene, and she actually escapes that time. And he is sent to jail for theft because Francisca says to him, I don't want to be with you anymore, and this is not what I want for myself. And so he is advised by somebody that if he were to make money, maybe she would come around. So because he doesn't work, what he does is steal, and that lands him in jail basically for 4 years and 4 months. And so that's how we know about his past. This is where Felix is coming from.
Right.
Very typical in naturalist novels, like you said. And then we go back to the present at the end of this chapter. And really, in the present, it's the night before Felix and his gang are due to leave for the woods, because that's what they're going to do. They're going to go to the woods, and they're going to start terrorizing the people around, particularly the liberals. And so his mother tries to convince him not to go. But Felix, of course, refuses and even attempts to kill her by just attacking her and, with his fists. He tries to hit her and kill her, but she barely escapes. I think she hides under a sofa or something like that. It's already a very violent situation. She's almost unharmed, but
still.
But he's trying to kill his mother.
Right. And that's puts it at a very, very violent level.
Now, we can also see, besides that, that there's somebody kind of trying to manipulate him in some sort of way, and that is Father Contento. Because here is where he really, we already sense that he's a very violent man, this priest, but here he actually verbalizes this, and he admits to having sexually assaulted women in the past.
Wow.
And I'm going to read this.
An excerpt?
This little excerpt,
Okay.
which I have translated from Spanish because we don't have a translation of his work. Father Contento is talking to Felix after Felix tries to kill his own mother. And this is what he says to him. Father Contento talking. You must kill without talking, as quietly as possible. I have killed a woman who resisted me and who bit my neck because I tried to kiss her. You know what I did? No tragedy and no threats. Be suave, reserved, tactful most of all. See how cynical this person is. You know, tactful. Talking about killing, be tactful, you know. I tricked her and took her down by the river and threw her in after having strangled her.
Oh my goodness.
Quite the priest, right?
Uh-huh.
And so that she wouldn't rise to the water surface, I put a stone on her head, very tactfully, of course, he says. Now, this is something to laugh about, to think about it.
I know,
he's killing a
crazy.
woman. And then he even reflects about it with this almost rhetorical question where he says, who would suspect me, being such a quiet man?
Quiet and a man of the church, so he gets away with that.
He has a position that definitely allows him to get away with this, and by talking to Felix like this all the time,
he plants those seeds of hatred and also violence.
Especially because he plays a little bit with Felix in the way that he is reminding him constantly about the fact that his former girlfriend is now married to another. So this is a character that knows the psychology of the people around him, who is probably more intelligent than the people around him, but who uses this intelligence in a rather evil way, which is really the opposite of what a priest, a man of God, should be doing.
And what is his intent? Is it because he is opposed to the liberals? Is this a kind of a political ideology that's motivating Father Contento?
In the case of Father Contento, it's hard to tell.
It's not.
I think there's a little bit of ideology in that, but I think there's also a sadistic sort of side to this character.
Right, so he's a sociopath, psychopath kind of character, where he's inherent. Well, I mean, I don't want to use that same term, but where he enjoys violence.
He definitely does enjoy violence. Not only violence towards women, but violence in general. And I think there is, in a way, a point of contact there with the character of Felix. The only difference, and we will see this in a little bit in chapter 3, is that Father Contento does seem to have a certain allegiance to the Carlist ideology.
Right.
Whereas Felix really does not seem to have any allegiance to anything other than himself and his own instincts and the idea of just creating misery and havoc for everybody else.
Right. It seems like Father Contento, although he has the same impulses, like these violent impulses, he's able to control them. And like you mentioned, no one suspects him because of the position he holds and because of the way he acts outwardly. And his public persona is one that doesn't give him away, but it's in a way that, Father Contento is like, he seems like the good version, although we know that he's not of Felix, who obviously has no self-control.
And that's one of the differences, really, between the two characters, because in the case of Father Contento, the idea of keeping appearances is important for him because he says very clearly, I don't want to hang.
Right.
He knows that the consequences of his actions would be terrible for himself, and he wants to stay away from the gallows.
Right.
Whereas in the case of Felix, what you see is what you get, really.
Right.
He is just a very openly violent character that is not really hiding anything because he's just not able to do so.
Right.
So yeah, definitely in that respect, you're absolutely right. There is a difference between these two characters, and at the same time, a point of contact in this,
Right.
I guess, interest in hurting other people. But in many cases, it's also an interest in fulfilling their own desires and their own needs. You know, I think that's also very clear throughout the novel. As we move into chapter 3, really chapter 3 is the longest chapter, is the most violent chapter. Well, not the most violent, I wouldn't say, but really, really violent
Right.
already. You know, we've seen some violence, now it's starting to really erupt here. It's a chapter where Felix and his gang, with Father Contento present, have captured several liberals and proceed to torture them before throwing them still alive into the cave or the chasm of Igúzquiza. Remember, very narrow but very deep. There was no way they could come out of there, especially after the torture. And they are just thrown in there after being tortured, still alive, and left to starve because they can't get out.
Right.
And nobody can hear them. This is something that
It's horrific.
is horrific. I can't even think about that. About being in a situation like that, but it's something that actually happened in real life. I mean, there is
is historical evidence for this.
There's evidence that this has happened, during these really bloody Carlist wars. Well, bloody like any war, really,
right.
And, the interesting thing here is what you just mentioned, the idea that Father Contento is presented, the priest is presented as the spiritual force behind this gang of thieves and behind Felix. So Felix does the stuff.
Right.
And Father Contento kind of pushes him towards doing the stuff. So the spiritual grounding, the mastermind behind all of
is
the
Father Contento.
Horrors is a priest. Not surprising, that Sawa was such an anti-clerical writer, and one that wrote a book like another novel, like I said before, Criadero de Curas, where he really criticizes seminaries. The scenes of torture are very violent, but interestingly, the description of the actual throwing of the prisoners into the cave is kind of telegraphic. There's a lot of silences in that. It's really deftly done. I think it might be a way of kind of juxtaposing the horror with, which has been graphically described, with a horror that one has to imagine.
Right.
I think he does it, Sawa as a narrator does that very well.
Perhaps it's also a way of foreshadowing or giving us a sense that once you're in that cave, no one can hear you. So there's no utterances, from the part of the narrative itself, and therefore, and also, those poor tortured souls who are thrown into the chasm, they won't be heard. So in a way, that juxtaposition works well in terms of what's going to ultimately happen to them. They're silenced.
That's right. It's not like Don Quixote coming back of the Cave of Montesinos, but when you're thrown into that chasm,
that's it.
That's it for you.
So,
and you'll go wherever you believe that you're going to go after that, but it's not back up to the real world. That's for sure. Now, this is where I'm saying that after all of this happens and all of these prisoners have been executed, not really killed, but almost.
Right.
Eventually they will die. We really see at this point that Felix doesn't really act in the pursuit of any political ideology. He says so himself. He has this fairly long speech where he talks about doing this, but not to help the Carlists, not just to kill the liberals because they're liberals, but just because he enjoys the violence of killing, and he wants to take revenge on the fact that people have put him in jail. He believes that that happened unfairly.
So
He puts a spin on it, really, because he did. He did. He did
steal.
He was violent. He's still being incredibly violent, but he puts a
But
spin
he
on it
doesn't
by
want to
saying
take ownership of
it's not
his
really-
actions.
Exactly. Almost presents himself as a victim of the
It's
of
very,
the social system.
yeah, a very narcissistic way.
When really we have here a
presenting
character that does not wish to conform himself to the social norms,
Right.
but he's able to put a spin on it
And make himself
and
the
make
victim.
him. That's right. And something else that's very important at the end of this chapter is that it really brings to life something that is implied until now in the novel. The fact that in reality, all of this that's happening, all of this that Felix is doing, what he really wants to do is to take revenge on two very specific characters.
And that is, of course, Francisca and Sebastián.
That's right, his former girlfriend and her husband.
Even though he never really loves her because he mistreated her, but he sees her as a possession, something that belonged to him, and he can't accept her leaving him
That's
and
right.
marrying Sebastián.
That's right. And even when she said after his trying to rape her, which he didn't succeed in at that point, she says she doesn't want to see him anymore. But he can't really conform to that either. He can't accept that situation. So this idea of the revenge, this revengeful stance that this character takes, is there all the time, and is also fed by the comments from the priest. So it's not just in himself, which it is, but it's also being
kind of like adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly.
To
A
really
lot of the time, really. There's many instances in the novel where this happens. You're listening to a new episode of
Tracing Text
with Anton
and Sylvia.
and we are talking about The Cave of Igúzquiza by Alejandro Sawa, one of the great Bohemian writers of the 19th and early 20th century in Spain.
So now we're closing in with chapter 4, our final chapter. And you mentioned that it has a very extremely violent climax.
That's right, very much so. In chapter 4, at the outset of chapter 4, Francisca, the former girlfriend of Felix, has been taken prisoner by Felix's gang and kept in a room at an inn. Felix enters the room at the beginning of the chapter with the clear intention, he doesn't say it, but with the clear intention of sexually assaulting her, finally. What he wasn't able to accomplish a few years back, he is going to accomplish now, no matter what and no matter how. Because now this idea of the possession becomes even more obvious in that she is a prisoner of the gang and of Felix. Of course, Francisca tries to get out of this situation, begs him not to attack her because she knows what's happening or what's going to happen. She and her husband have a little kid. She tries to appeal to
his sense of humanity,
which does not exist.
Right, so that's pointless.
The kid is going to be motherless, and that sort of thing. But when Felix demands that she quit her husband and run away with him, and she refuses, then Felix just rapes her brutally.
Does this happen from a historical perspective? Is he accused of rape?
It doesn't look like it in the excerpts that we have in the note to the reader at the beginning, but who knows what he has done.
Right, so that's possible.
He might not have raped a specific woman that was the girlfriend, or maybe he has, I don't know, but I would be surprised if that is not part of the atrocities that the real
committed.
character, the real person, Felix Samaniego, actually did during his life. This is where the literature and the history
is definitely fuzzy. It gets really fuzzy.
Yes,
and we have to assume this is he took a liberty at writing from his imagination what happens.
That's why I'm saying literary and history collude, and once that happens, once they collide,
Well, it's definitely
it's not history anymore.
Right.
It's not history anymore. But in a way, it doesn't really matter because,
Right.
again, literature is not verifiable outside of the actual book.
Mm-hmm.
The Felix that we read about here never necessarily existed. Not in
Right.
the way that Sawa talks about
Right,
him.
not the way he develops.
Now, this is a terrible, atrocious ending for the novel, if it ended like this.
But it gets only worse.
But it only gets worse, exactly. Because, after the rape is consummated, Francisca finally comes around. She comes to, she wakes up. And Felix is still there in the room, sitting on a couch or something. And so Francisca has a very violent reaction at that point because she really understands, starts to take in what's happened. And she attempts to kill him, but of course she isn't strong enough to kill such a brute. Because Felix has always been described as a very, even handsome, powerful, strong, muscular man. Of course, Francisca is not going to be able to do anything to him. She tries, kind of desperately.
But is unable.
Can't do it. And of course, as you're reading it, you tend to think, is she really going to accomplish this? But she doesn't. And at the end of the novel, and this is where really the novel, to me, is shocking because of the level of violence and which is part of the naturalism, but taken to a very extreme level. Felix is enraged, of course, because she's trying to attack him. And he's intent on showing the brutality of his power, because right now it becomes, as it's always been, but now even more obviously, a situation of a power struggle. Right? Where there isn't much struggle, really, because he is the powerful one and she is not. So he opens the door of that room and encourages the rest of the gang. The priest, Father Contento included, he's actually the first that comes in, as though he were waiting around the corner, So even in this moment, we have this anticlericalism taken to the extreme. And Felix encourages the rest of the gang to rape Francisca, one after the other, what we could really describe as a gang rape. Which is just atrocious, terrible. And this is really a heart-wrenching finale for the novel, taking naturalism to its most dramatic consequences. The group sexual assault on Francisca is described in a rather crude sort of way, which I was surprised about for a novel
What was the critical
from 1888.
reception?
Not much of it. There's really not much.
So
it's not a very well-known novel.
So even in Spain, the critics didn't write much about.
Not much. If you look up even more modern articles about Sawa, most of them don't talk about la sima de Igúzquiza. There are some I guess studies of his whole production that do talk about it,
but in a more general way.
There's not. I haven't really seen an artitle that
focuses on the brutality that occurs within the novel, and especially in this time period, late 1800s, when it's written.
So it's really a surprising ending, incredibly brutal, incredibly violent.
And then ultimately she's left to die in the chasm as well, right?
We don't really see that.
Oh, we don't see that.
But the narrator hints at the fact that after they're done with her, if she's still alive after that happens, which we don't know. She will be left to die like all the other
tortured
victims in the chasm or in the cave of Igúzquiza, and that's the end, really, of the novel, and it ends almost really abruptly like that. There's no mention of what happened afterwards. Of course, we know from the note to the reader that this man, Felix, and his gang were taken prisoners at some point and were tried. But the novel is only interested in presenting
This
those
particular-
4 chapters, that specific moment of the terrible history
Right.
of this bandit, ending in this incredibly violent climax of chapter 4.
Right. What's interesting to me is that obviously a lot of it has to do with anti-clericalism. But, do you see in some of his other novels or his other work, if you're familiar with it, also any threads of misogyny? Or is this just to illustrate the extent of his dislike of the church? Because really, although Felix is the bandit, the mastermind, from what I understand, is like Father Contento.
Mm-hmm. Well, at this point, I haven't read any of the other novels of Sawa. I have some on my night table right now. Kind of not the best thing to have on your night table because you might have nightmares.
I know, it doesn't
just
sound
from
that
reading
great.
this. But it is clear that the anti-clericalism is there all the time.
Right.
I would not say that his description of women
Is misogynist.
comes from a misogynistic sort of stance. There is, however, a study that I haven't read yet, written by a woman, which talks about the representation of women in Sawa's fiction.
Okay.
So that would be an interesting one to read and to see, what it is that this critic says about Sawa's Cima de Igúzquiza and the other novels. There's one novel, like I said before, called The Woman That Belongs to Everyone,
Right.
La Mujer de Todo el Mundo. There's obviously a constant representation of women or female characters in his novels, but having only read this one at this point, I would like to concentrate a little more on this idea of a character like Felix who decides himself not to conform to the norms of the society of his
Right.
time. This idea of anti-clericalism, and of course, this power struggle that he seems to have
Right.
throughout the whole novel with the figure of Francisca, who is really one of the few characters that actually resists him at some point.
Right. That's very interesting novel for the time.
Very interesting, yeah.
In some ways it's, not only interesting, but it's very daring, as to what I would say, considering the time period.
In many ways, it's unusual, and I
Unusual.
wonder if that might have something to do with the fact that it has been so forgotten
Right.
over the years. Sawa
Right.
is the clear example of a writer who did not really write a lot of fiction, and maybe for that reason, his fiction is quite forgotten these
Right.
days. And really, this edition that we have here on the table is a good one. It's one that I would definitely recommend. It's still possible to find. It's only like 7 years old. But it is also possible to find reprints of some of his other novels, some of these cheaper editions that one can
Right.
find on Amazon where,
Right.
basically it's just the text
Right.
and nothing else. And that's the way in which I have acquired some of his other fiction, which I'm really interested in after reading this.
Now, you said it wasn't translated into English. Was it translated into any other languages?
I would not this novel itself, I don't think, but some of his other work must have been. I don't know really, and if somebody out there knows, you could let us know if there's any book ever translated into English by or about Sawa. But I haven't been able to find one. Not at this point, not yet. But you can never know. You can never say that something doesn't exist,
Right.
because it very, very well may be
Right.
that it does.
So, in closing, I guess, what can we take away from this novel about Alejandro Sawa? What do you want to share with our listeners that you think is, really important, some important highlight?
If you read Spanish, this is a novel that one can read fairly quickly. It's not very long, and it's a novel that really embodies the naturalism style in the way that Alejandro Sawa understood it. He concentrates on the basis of human feelings and emotions, presents really violent situations, in many ways, as you said, to paint a really negative portrait of the church, but also to show how a character like Felix Domingo de Rosa Samaniego, a real character, how he, at some point in his life, refuses to conform to the norms of the society of his time, and what that means for himself and also for the people around him. Usually, any sort of idealism, I think, any sort of situation where one person or a group of people don't conform to the reality of the time, to the social accepted and acceptable social norms of the time, can only end in a disaster.
Right.
And this novel really, I think, illustrates that very well.
Right.
And that's why I was drawn to this novel from the very first page to the last. And also this connection between history and literature, and how, in my opinion, history becomes something else once it enters the realm of literature, is one of the reasons why this novel will be interesting. And it's something that is, again, very clearly portrayed by Sawa in this novel, which, as far as I know, is the only novel that he wrote that is based on any sort of real historical event.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's a fascinating discussion, and I'm glad that, we are at our 13th podcast, that we have completed that. So I guess now it's time to invite our listeners, who
are readers as well,
who are also
maybe,
readers, that's right, that if they have questions or comments, we welcome those. We would like feedback as well, and that they can email us at tracingtext@gmail.com. That's tracingtext@gmail.com.
I bet you can't repeat that. Oh, no, you don't have to do it.
And then, of course, once we have this podcast out into the podcast sphere, I don't know, you can download it via Podomatic or via iTunes. You can subscribe, and then, of course, you always post it via YouTube as well.
Yes, if you go on YouTube, you can find Tracing Text as well. All 13 of the podcasts, I think, are there, and this one for sure will also be posted on YouTube. So it's 3 possibilities: Podomatic, iTunes, and YouTube.
Right. So there are many options out there for you. And I'm not sure what I'll be talking about for next month, but I hope to bring a fun topic that everyone will enjoy. So I guess that's it for podcast number 13.
Yeah, you're going to leave that up in the air.
Yeah, I'm going to leave that up in the air.
I'm
going to think about that. I'm not quite sure. I may return to the topic of the femme fatale, one of another of the authors that I have studied. But I'm not quite sure yet if I want to commit to that.
I must say that the one we did not long ago about Valeria Luiselli was extremely interesting to me. So I would encourage anyone listening out there, if you have missed that one, make sure to listen to Tracing Text number 12 about Valeria Luiselli.
I just finished another one of her novels, The Story of My Teeth, and it's interesting. I'm not sure if I want to do another. I mean, I'm still thinking about that novel. It's a very interesting novel, but it's very different as well. So I'm going to leave it open in terms of the topic.
It'll remain a mystery for now.
For now.
This has been another episode of
Tracing Text
with Anton
and Sylvia.
Live, coming to you live from deep in the heart of the state of Tennessee. Signing off now. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk about literature, Sylvia and I, very soon.
Thank you and goodbye.